Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and with the availability of true long haulers like the PMDG 777 and the fly-by-wire A380, I decided to take a closer look at how to actually do a long haul flight, which is really what these planes were built to do. And today we'll look at some of the things to keep in mind when planning this type of flight, as well as a bunch of tips and suggestions that I came across while researching all of this. If you've never done a long haul flight before, you might be wondering why anyone would even want to spend up to 12 hours or more flying in a simulator. And while it's definitely not something that I would do every day or even every other month for that matter, as a one-off or occasional type of thing, it's really the best way to experience what a fully loaded plane with cargo, people, and fuel can actually do. It's pretty incredible to take off on one end of the world just below your max takeoff weight, which in the A380 can be upwards of 1,000,000 pounds, and then hours later arrive halfway across the globe in a fraction of the time that it would take with any other mode of transport. And even if you're not a fan of doing it in real time, there are also ways to shave the time required down by a fair bit, and we'll look at that as well. We're going to use a flight from LA to London so that we can have a look at a few different route options, and SimBrief really is invaluable in deciding which way you're going to go. I've set my origin and destination airports already, as well as filled out the airplane information. We'll use the 777 for this scenario. And if we have a look at the route that it's proposed by default, it's about 5,200 miles. And this brings us to our first decision point, which is whether to use a more direct Great Circle route, which will be the shortest distance that you can make the flight, or instead use one of the preset routes that run between North America and Europe, which are called NATs, or North Atlantic tracks. NAT routes are predetermined paths that change daily based on weather and wind patterns, with the northern routes for traveling east to west and the southern routes for traveling west to east, and they can only be used between certain hours of the day. Each track has an entry and an exit waypoint on either end of it, and a lot of the waypoints in between are actually entered as latitudes and longitudes into the CDU rather than named waypoints like you're probably used to. What this looks like in the CDU after you import it from SimBrief is going to be different on Boeing and Airbus, with the 777 showing us the degrees of latitude and longitude as the waypoint identifier, whereas on an Airbus it'll appear as a numbered LL or lat long waypoint. And if you want to see the exact coordinates for it, you can bring up the menu to insert a next waypoint and it'll show it to you right there. The other type of route that you can use is called a random route, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You're basically free to pick your own route with random waypoints, and it can take advantage of unique wind patterns or avoid any significant weather. SimBrief offers you a variety of both types in its suggested route options, and it's definitely worth bringing up the list of routes and the comparison tool to find the fastest route, which isn't always going to be the shortest route, as we're about to see. For example, if I start from the default route that it's offering, it goes across one of the NATs and it gives us a total airtime of 9 hours and 55 minutes. So instead, if we go back through and pick a route that's going to be much closer to the Great Circle or the shortest distance between the 2 points, say for example like this one here, if we compare that to our first option, you can see it's definitely a lot shorter in terms of distance, about 400 miles or so. But because of the wind component, it's actually going to add on an extra 7 minutes to our flight, so it's not really going to help us much. I'll usually give myself a top 2 or 3 in terms of the fastest options for the route, and then from there, if you have a Navigraph subscription, you can bring up the significant weather overlay, which will show you if there are any major convective clouds, turbulence, or icing along those routes. And depending on the altitude that it goes up to, you could consider changing your route out for something that would avoid those areas. If we zoom in a little bit more on our route, there are a couple of pockets of weather along the way, with the red areas representing turbulence and the blue areas showing areas of icing. However, you have to look at the altitudes that it's going to affect as well, because it might be a non-factor. For example, this pocket over Ontario and Manitoba has icing up to 18,000 feet, so that won't be a problem for us because we'll be well above that altitude by the time that we get there. And the turbulence, on the other hand, comes right up to 36,000 feet, so that might just be on the limit where we could encounter a few extra bumps along the way. A quick note that if you're doing a trans-Pacific flight instead, there's a different track system there called PACOTS, and that'll mostly get you from Asia to North America and vice versa, as well as a couple of routes to and from Hawaii. However, if you're going to Australia, New Zealand, or anywhere in the South Pacific, you'll have to use a random route instead because there are no tracks that go there. Moving on from that, another thing that can be fun to look up depending on the airframe and airline that you're flying is the cost index that's typically used, which will affect your speed throughout the flight. So the higher the number is, the faster that you'll actually get to your destination. Real-world airlines obviously prefer to keep the cost index as low as possible to save on fuel costs, but in Flight Sim we don't have that limit, and this is one area where I tend to stray a little bit from the real world, and I try and get the best possible speed over fuel economy. The upper limit of the cost index is different depending on the airplane type, and if you hover over the field, you'll see what that maximum actually is. However, even with the max value, you start to get diminishing returns past a certain point, but on a long flight, saving even just 10 to 15 minutes can be worth it. Let's have a look at the ETOPS planning section now, which is what defines how far a plane can be from a diversion airport in the event that it only has a single operational engine. The number that goes with the ETOPS rating, say for example ETOPS 180, defines how many minutes you can be from a diversion airport. So a higher ETOPS rating opens up additional routes since you can be further away from a suitable runway. The way ETOPS works is it's not only based on the capabilities of the plane, but also on the airline that's operating it. But for flight sim purposes, I always end up using the maximum ETOPS rating for the plane in question, just to keep things simple since the diversion is unlikely anyways. The dropdown that we're interested in is the target scenario, and if I pick something small, like say 90 minutes, it actually can't calculate our ETOPS scenario because our route doesn't have airfields that would keep us within 90 minutes of an airfield. And you can see it's defaulted to 120 instead, since the 777 is capable of much more. In fact, the 300 ER, which we'll be using for today, is rated for up to 330 minutes. And once I select that from the dropdown, you can see that it extends the range and the options that we have for our ETOPS scenario by a fair bit. The map's also showing us the entry and exit points of the part of the flight that's being done under ETOPS, and between them there's the ETP, or equal time point, which is the point where the time it would take to reach the exit airport is the same as it would be to reach the entry airport. In the 777, the easiest way to see the ETP is to enter it as a separate waypoint along your route. So if we were to have a look at our briefing preview and we go down to the flight log section, there'll be an entry for the ETP. And with that, we can look at what the previous waypoint is to figure out where to insert it on the lakes page. You'll want to enter the complete coordinates, so degrees, minutes, and seconds, rather than just the degrees, so that the waypoint gets added in just the right spot along your route. And once you've got that done, you'll be able to very easily visualize where your point of no return is for the ETOPS portion of the route. To make sure that SimBrief includes the ETOPS planning as part of your flight plan, you'll want to make sure that it's checked in the selections menu. And while you're here, also make sure that the planned step climbs is checked as well, which we're going to look into a little bit more now. As the plane burns fuel, it gets lighter, and as that happens throughout your flight, it means that you can actually climb higher to get better efficiency as well, and these are planned out as step climbs along your route. When you look at your briefing preview, it should have added them for you, and for our flight to London, we've actually got 4 steps. Our initial cruise altitude at 31,000 feet, and then once we reach the Parker VOR, we can go to 33,000 feet, then we've got 35,000 at Porty, and finally 37 at Zetbo. In the 777, if you look on the ND, you'll see SC points that indicate where you can climb to your next step altitude. And on the legs page of the CDU, you'll be able to see about where it's doing the steps as well, because the altitude switches from one flight level to the other between waypoints. You can also see how long you have until the next step climb by looking at the progress page, and it'll have an estimated time where it expects you'll reach the next one, so you can compare that to the clock and get an idea of how long you have. One extra feature that the 777 has is that it can auto step climb for you. So if you're planning on stepping away for a little bit during the flight, which is reasonable on a long haul, in the tablet, what you can do is enable the auto step climb option, And once it reaches a step climb point, so long as you're in VNAV PAT, it'll automatically increase your altitude on the MCP and start a climb for you. At this point, we're going to head into a few quick tips and tricks, and for starters, this is one of the only occasions where you're likely to use the center tanks in the 777, and if you do, you'll get an ICAS message to remind you to turn the fuel pumps on for them, because it is easy to forget about them if all you ever do is shorter flights. That'll clear the ICAS message, and the pressure warning that you see here is going to disappear once the engines are started as well. And then once you're close to running out of fuel on the center tanks during the flight, you'll get another ICAS message now telling you that you're low on fuel on the center tanks, at which point you can turn the pumps back off. There will likely still be a little bit of fuel left in the center tanks, but it'll automatically transfer that back into the main tanks via a scavenge pump, and all of that happens without you having to intervene. In terms of timing, I find it's actually best to do these long hauls in the fall or in the winter because there's less light outside, and it just adds to the ambiance when you can match the lighting in the sim to what's going on in the real world. A lot of overseas flights leave near the end of the day anyway, so if you start your flight as it's getting dark out, it gives you plenty of time to get through the night portion of the flight, and then as the sun rises, you can progressively turn some lights on in the room to simulate daytime as well. Another thing to be aware of is that over oceanic areas, rather than using the VHF radio frequencies that you typically use to talk to ATC, you would instead use the HF radio, which works a little bit differently. And each ATC platform does it slightly differently as well, be it beyond ATC, say Intentions, VATSIM, or any other one. So you'll want to make sure that you know what the procedure is before you actually get going. If you're going to be stepping away for a while, one option to reduce the power usage of your computer is to exit full screen mode by pressing Alt-Enter, and then you can resize the window so that it's smaller, and that should make your computer strain a fair bit less. And it's probably best to resize the window from the pause menu just to be on the safe side. If you're not fussed about doing your long haul in real time, which is totally fair, you can change the sim rate to make things go by faster, but you have to be careful with this because if you set it too high, you can easily end up with a choppy frame rate that you can't recover from. You can assign keys to the sim rate up and down options to control it directly in Flight Sim, but as far as I could tell, there's no built-in way to see what you've actually set the sim rate to, so it can be a little bit tricky to get it back to 1x. The 777 really stands out when it comes to doing long hauls in accelerated time though, because it not only exposes the sim rate to you on the tablet, it can also control it dynamically throughout the flight. Once you enable auto time compression, it'll slowly increase the sim rate up to the maximum sim rate that you specify in the dropdown next to it. And if for whatever reason it detects that it can't keep up with the higher sim rate, it'll automatically reduce it for you. So it gives you a nice little protection there. This allows you to get through the more boring parts of the flight where you likely can't see much anyways because it's dark out without missing anything important. And although I've used it up to 8x on some sectors, I'd recommend trying it on 4x first just to make sure that your hardware can handle it well. If you learned something useful today about planning your next long haul flight, please make sure to like the video and subscribe as well so that you don't miss out on similar content to this one.